Christmas morning had always been a time of warmth and togetherness in our home. The smell of cinnamon and pine filled the air, and the soft hum of Christmas carols played from the old radio in the corner. This year, however, the house was silent. My wife, Laura, had left early for church as she always did, and I sat alone in the dimly lit living room, staring at the blinking lights of the Christmas tree. I should have been happy. We had a beautiful home, a stable life, and a marriage that had endured a decade of highs and lows. But beneath the surface, something was off. Laura had returned from her last military deployment almost a year ago, and while she looked the same, something inside her had changed. She was distant, quieter. At first, I told myself it was the trauma of war, the things she had seen, the people she had lost. But as months passed, the distance between us grew into an invisible wall. Then came the nights she would stay out late, claiming she was catching up with old friends. The sudden secrecy with her phone. The moments I would wake up in the middle of the night to find the bed beside me empty. I convinced myself I was being paranoid. She had never given me a reason to doubt her before. But doubt has a way of creeping in, no matter how much you try to bury it. Laura had mentioned she would be home for dinner, that she had planned something special for us. She had booked a reservation at our favorite restaurant, something we hadn't done in months. Maybe she was trying. Maybe I was wrong about everything. Or maybe I wasn't. At 2 p.m., I received a message from a friend. Just a single image. Laura, sitting on a park bench, holding a man's hand. Not just any man. Henry. He was older, maybe in his late 50s, with silver hair and deep-set eyes that carried years of sorrow. I recognized him immediately. I had seen him before. He was a regular at the coffee shop Laura liked to visit. A lonely old man who always sat in the same corner, reading the same newspaper. But this wasn't just a friendly conversation. Laura's body language told me everything I needed to know. The way she leaned into him, the way he cradled her hand in his as if she were something fragile and precious. I didn't want to believe it. I grabbed my coat and car keys, my heart pounding so loudly in my chest it drowned out the Christmas music still playing in the background. Within minutes, I was there, standing across the street, watching my wife share an intimate moment with another man on Christmas Day. I wanted to walk over, to demand an explanation, to ask her why. But instead, I watched. I watched as she wiped a tear from Henry's cheek. I watched as he brought her hand to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to her skin. And then I saw the worst part. She smiled. A genuine, tender smile. A smile she hadn't given me in years. The kind of smile you give someone you love. A past I never knew. I didn't confront her. Not yet. I drove home, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. That evening, Laura came home as if nothing had happened. She kissed my cheek, handed me a neatly wrapped gift, and told me how much she loved me. I should have said something. I should have asked. But instead, I unwrapped the gift, a leather-bound journal with my initials engraved on the cover. I saw it and thought of you, she said softly. I nodded, forcing a smile. It's perfect. That night, after Laura fell asleep, I went downstairs and poured myself a drink. I opened her laptop, something I had never done before. Not out of distrust, but because we had always respected each other's privacy. But tonight, I needed answers. And I found them. Emails. Letters. Years' worth of correspondence between Laura and Henry. He wasn't just some stranger. He was her first love. The man she had loved before she left for the military. The man she had been forced to leave behind when she was deployed to war. And the man she had never truly let go of. The messages weren't explicit. There was no mention of betrayal, no confessions of love. But there was something worse. There was intimacy. Inside jokes. Old memories. The kind of emotional closeness that should have belonged to me. She had never stopped loving him. And now, I had to decide what to do with that truth. The final gift. The next morning, I made breakfast like I always did. Laura sat across from me, sipping her coffee, oblivious to the storm inside me. I was thinking, I said finally, my voice steady. Maybe we should take a trip. Just the two of us. Get away for a while. Her eyes lit up. That sounds perfect. She had no idea I had already packed my bags. That afternoon, I left. No goodbye. No confrontation. Just a single note on the kitchen table. Merry Christmas, Laura. I hope Henry was worth it. As Laura walked briskly through the icy streets, the cold wind bit at her cheeks, but she barely felt it. Her mind was on Henry, the way his shoulders had sagged under the weight of rejection, the way his hands trembled with quiet grief. She had seen pain before, in war zones and on the battlefield, but this was a different kind of suffering. This was loneliness, the kind that crept into a person's bones and hollowed them out from the inside. She entered a small cafe on the corner, the warm scent of fresh bread and coffee hitting her immediately. It was cozy, the kind of place she used to sit in with her squad mates after long shifts at the base hospital. She pulled out what little cash she had left and ordered a steaming cup of coffee, a warm pastry, and a Christmas card from the small rack near the counter. Sitting at a tiny table near the window, she opened the card and hesitated. What could she possibly say to ease the kind of pain Henry carried? After a moment, she began to write. Henry, I know today must feel unbearable. But please know, you are not alone. I see you. I hear you. And you matter. Merry Christmas. She signed her name with a small flourish, then tucked the card into the envelope. When she returned to the bench, Henry hadn't moved. His eyes were fixed on the frozen ground, as if looking anywhere else was too much effort. Merry Christmas, Laura said softly, offering him the coffee and pastry. Henry looked up, startled. His eyes, dull with sadness, flickered with something, recognition? He took the cup with both hands, his fingers wrapping around it as if he were absorbing the warmth through his skin. His voice cracked and he swallowed hard. It's been a long time since anyone did something like this for me. Laura nodded, fighting the lump in her throat. She had seen soldiers react the same way when given something as simple as a warm blanket or a letter from home. Basic human kindness had a way of breaking a person when they had gone too long without it. Impulsively, she blurted out, "Why don't you come over for Christmas dinner?" Henry blinked at her, his expression unreadable. "I wouldn't want to impose." "You wouldn't be," she insisted. "I was just going to eat alone anyway." For a long moment, Henry said nothing. Then, finally, he gave a small nod. "All right," he whispered. The walk to her apartment was quiet, but not uncomfortable. Henry seemed lost in thought, occasionally glancing at her as if trying to understand why she was doing this. When they arrived, Laura pushed open the door, revealing a modest but clean living room. A small Christmas tree stood in the corner, its lights flickering softly. She had decorated it out of habit, though she had no real reason to celebrate this year. "Make yourself at home," she said, motioning for Henry to sit. He hesitated before lowering himself onto the couch, still clutching the coffee cup as though afraid it would vanish. Laura busied herself in the kitchen, heating up the simple meal she had planned for herself. As she moved, she felt Henry's eyes on her, studying her. "You were in the military," he said finally. It wasn't a question. She glanced at him, surprised. "How did you know?" "The way you walk. The way you scanned the room when we came in. Like you're still on alert." He sipped his coffee. "I was in Vietnam. Long time ago." Something in Laura's chest tightened. She had treated older veterans before, men who had carried their ghosts for decades. "I was a combat nurse," she admitted. "Afghanistan." Henry nodded slowly. "Saw some bad things, I bet?" "Yeah," she murmured. The air grew heavy between them, thick with unspoken memories. Then, without warning, Henry chuckled, a dry, bitter sound. "What's funny?" she asked. "I was just thinking," he said, shaking his head. "All those years ago, I fought in a war for a country that still treated me like I didn't belong when I came back." Laura's stomach twisted. She knew what he meant before he even said it. "They called me a hero while I was over there," Henry continued. "But when I got home, I was just another black man to them. Couldn't get a job. Couldn't sit in the same places as the people I fought alongside. My own son grew up hearing the same slurs I did." He let out a breath. "And now, even he's turned his back on me." Laura's grip on the counter tightened. She thought of all the men she had patched up over the years, men of all colors, all backgrounds. War didn't care about skin color. Neither did a bullet. But the country they came back to? That was a different story. I'm sorry, she said finally. You deserved better. Henry looked at her for a long moment. We all did. She placed a plate of food in front of him, then sat across from him with her own. They ate in silence for a while, the only sounds the clinking of forks against plates and the faint hum of Christmas music from the radio. After a while, Henry cleared his throat. You ever feel like you don't belong anymore? Laura nodded slowly. All the time. Henry exhaled. Then I guess we got that in common. The hours passed, and the conversation drifted from war to family to the things they had lost. Laura found herself talking about things she hadn't spoken of in years, and Henry, in turn, shared pieces of himself that no one had asked for in a long time. For the first time in what felt like forever, Laura didn't feel alone. And neither did Henry. Outside, the snow fell in heavy sheets, blanketing the city in white. But inside, in the small, dimly lit apartment, warmth lingered. Maybe Christmas wasn't about the past or the pain. Maybe, just maybe, it was about finding someone who understood. Henry stepped inside Laura's small apartment, immediately noticing the quiet signs of struggle. The dim light barely illuminated the stack of unopened envelopes on the table, bills, no doubt, judging by the red markings on some of them. The tiny Christmas tree in the corner stood with only a handful of decorations, its sparse branches making the space feel even lonelier. When Laura opened the fridge, Henry caught a glimpse of how little was inside: a half-empty carton of milk, a few eggs, and some leftover casserole in a small container. She pulled out 2 bowls and poured steaming soup into them, then scooped a portion of the casserole onto each plate. It was a simple meal, but Henry knew better than to complain. He had spent enough nights in shelters, or worse, out on the streets, where a meal like this would have been a rare blessing. They sat across from each other at the small table, eating in silence at first. Henry glanced at Laura, watching the way her shoulders seemed permanently tense, as if she was always prepared for something bad to happen. It was a look he had seen before in the faces of old war buddies who never quite made it home, even after they left the battlefield. Finally, he set down his spoon and spoke. You got a story, don't you? Laura exhaled sharply through her nose. Everyone's got a story. I'm listening. For a long moment she hesitated, then put her spoon down. She stared at the chipped edge of her bowl as she spoke. After I left the military, I tried to adjust to civilian life. It wasn't easy. I got hired by a private security firm. A big one. They loved ex-military. Said we had discipline. Knew how to handle ourselves. Her lips curled into a humorless smile. I thought I'd found something stable. The pay was decent. Not great, but enough. Then I started noticing things. Henry didn't interrupt, but he could see where this was going. Laura's fingers curled into a fist on the table. I saw how they treated people. The security detail wasn't just about protecting businesses, it was about intimidation. They had contracts with certain companies, and those companies weren't exactly clean. They were using us to rough up employees who asked too many questions, keep protesters from getting too loud, and make problems disappear. She shook her head. I wasn't going to be part of that. So, I started documenting everything. Gathering proof. I figured I could report it, do something about it. Henry sighed. And they found out. She gave a dry chuckle. Oh yeah. One day, I show up to work and my badge doesn't work. Security stops me at the front desk. Next thing I know, I'm being escorted out like a criminal. No severance, no final paycheck. Just a warning that if I talk, I won't like the consequences. Henry let out a low whistle. They blackballed you? Laura nodded. Tried to find another job. Nobody would touch me. Word got around that I was difficult, that I couldn't be trusted. And with my military injury, she rubbed her right shoulder absently. Let's just say employers don't love hiring someone with physical limitations. Henry's gaze softened. He knew how that felt. He had been a young man when he returned from Vietnam, expecting to pick up where he left off. Instead, he found doors slamming in his face. No one wanted to hire a black veteran, especially not one with PTSD. He had been unstable, a liability. It didn't matter that he had risked his life for his country. His country had no use for him anymore. Laura scoffed, shaking her head. You know the funny thing? Some of the guys I served with, guys who barely knew how to tie their boots without help, came back and got handed jobs on a silver platter. Because they had the right connections. Right family name. Looked the part. She paused, then looked him in the eye. You know what I mean. Henry's jaw tightened. He knew. He set his spoon down and leaned back in his chair. I came back from Vietnam thinking I'd be treated like any other veteran. But turns out it didn't matter that I bled for this country. All they saw was my skin. Laura nodded grimly. I knew guys like that in my unit. Black soldiers who were some of the best damn men I'd ever met. But when we got home, suddenly, they were just another face people wanted to forget. Henry let out a bitter laugh. Ain't that the truth? For a moment, they sat there, the weight of history pressing down on them. Two soldiers from different wars, different lives, but the same damn story. Then Henry shook his head. And now you're stuck here. Scraping by. All 'cause you tried to do the right thing. Laura let out a breath. Yeah. But I'm still here. Henry watched her carefully. She was strong, he could see that, but she was also exhausted. He knew that look. Knew what it felt like when the world had beaten you down so many times you started wondering if it was even worth getting back up. After a long silence, he finally spoke. You know, I used to believe that if you fought hard enough, did the right thing, you'd be rewarded. But I learned the hard way that life don't work like that. Laura gave a small nod. Yeah. I've been figuring that out too. Henry stared at his empty bowl. I lost my job when I got back. Couldn't get hired anywhere decent. Ended up doing odd jobs just to keep food on the table for my boy. And you know what the worst part was? His voice dropped to a low, bitter whisper. My own son started to believe what the world said about me. That I was a failure. That I wasn't worth respecting. He let out a slow breath. And now he won't even let me see my grandson on Christmas? Laura's throat tightened. Henry. He waved a hand. Don't need pity. Just saying, I get it. You do everything right, and they still kick you down. Silence settled between them. The only sound was the faint hum of the heater struggling against the cold. Then Laura stood up. Come on. Henry looked up at her. Where? She gestured toward the couch. You're staying here tonight. I've got an extra blanket, and I don't want you out in the cold. Henry hesitated. He wasn't used to kindness, not anymore. But he saw something in Laura's eyes, something he hadn't seen in a long time. Understanding. He gave a small nod. All right. As Laura grabbed a blanket and pillow, Henry glanced at the tiny Christmas tree again. It wasn't much. It was barely decorated. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel completely alone. Laura stared at the four men standing in front of her door, their expensive suits starkly out of place against the crumbling hallway of her apartment building. The scent of old cigarette smoke and cheap air freshener filled the air, mixing with the cold December night that drifted in through the open door. Behind them, Henry stood, wrapped in his worn-out coat, the festive envelope clutched in his hands. His expression was calm, almost knowing, as if he had been waiting for this moment. Good evening, Laura, he said, his voice warm and steady. I hope I'm not intruding, but I wanted to see you again. Laura's eyes flicked between Henry and the lawyers. Their polished shoes barely made a sound against the peeling linoleum as they shifted uncomfortably in the dimly lit hallway. Something wasn't right. What's going on? She asked, her fingers tightening around the edge of the door. Henry stepped forward, holding out the envelope. You showed me kindness when I needed it most. Now it's my turn. She hesitated before taking it, her calloused hands brushing against the smooth wrapping paper. It was heavier than she expected. Slowly, she peeled back the festive cover, revealing a thick, formal-looking document inside. Her stomach clenched as she scanned the first few lines. Property transfer agreement. Laura's breath hitched. Her eyes darted back to Henry. What is this? Henry smiled, though there was something behind it. Something deeper, something tired. It's what you think it is. Laura shook her head, her pulse pounding. No, this has to be a mistake. Henry, I don't. One of the lawyers cleared his throat. Mr. Holloway is transferring ownership of his estate to you, Miss Carter. Effective immediately. The documents are in order. All we need is your signature. She let out a hollow laugh, stepping back as if the paper itself burned her fingers. His estate? Henry, what the hell is this? Henry exhaled, rubbing his hands together for warmth. I told you I had a son, Laura. A son who doesn't give a damn about me. A grandson I never get to see. I built my life for them, but they've made it clear, they don't want it. They don't want me. So, I figured, maybe someone else should have a chance. Laura's mouth went dry. Henry, I didn't help you for a reward. You don't owe me anything. Henry's eyes darkened. Owe you? No, Laura. You think this is about owing? You think this is charity? His voice was calm but firm, and for the first time, she caught a glimpse of something sharp beneath his kindness, something forged in decades of being dismissed, discarded. I spent years waiting for a world that never gave a damn about me. A world that took everything I had to give and left me with nothing. You saw me, Laura. Not as a burden, not as someone to be pitied. You saw me. And that means something. Laura's chest ached. One of the lawyers, a pale man with a clipped voice, took a step forward. If I may, Miss Carter, Mr. Holloway's estate is significant. Properties, liquid assets. I don't care about his goddamn assets. Laura snapped, glaring at the man. She turned back to Henry, frustration and confusion bubbling inside her. Why me? Why not? I don't know, a charity? A veterans group? Someone deserving? Henry's lips twitched, but there was no humor in it. Because I know how this world works. You think a charity's going to put my money where it matters? You think some corporate nonprofit's going to do anything but slap my name on a plaque and keep pushing paperwork? His voice dropped lower. No, Laura. I want to give it to someone who actually needs it. Someone who's earned it. Laura swallowed hard, her throat tight. She thought about her tiny apartment, the overdue bills stacked on the table. Thought about the nights she lay awake, wondering how much longer she could stretch her savings. Thought about how just yesterday, she had been debating whether she could afford to keep the heat on through the rest of winter. She thought about all the times she had been told no. No job. No help. No way forward. Henry knew what that felt like. Her fingers trembled as she gripped the edge of the contract. And what if I say no? Henry studied her. Then you say no. And I find someone else. She searched his face, looking for doubt, hesitation, something to tell her this wasn't real. But all she found was quiet certainty. The lawyers waited, silent and expectant. Laura took a slow breath, then reached for the pen. She pressed it to the paper, her signature inked in bold, unwavering strokes. One of the lawyers gave a curt nod. It's done. Henry smiled. Merry Christmas, Laura. She exhaled, the weight of everything settling over her. Merry Christmas. Laura's fingers trembled as she opened the envelope, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The paper inside was thick, expensive, and when she unfolded it, she nearly dropped it. Her breath hitched. The number was staggering. More money than she had ever seen in her life. More than enough to clear every debt, keep the heat running through winter, and ensure she never had to ration groceries again. Her head snapped up, her vision blurring slightly as she looked at Henry. I can't accept this. It's too much. Her voice wavered, not with ungratefulness, but with sheer disbelief. Henry didn't look surprised. He simply smiled, placing a firm but gentle hand on her shoulder. This isn't just about money, Laura, he said, his voice calm but full of something deeper, something unshakable. I know about your struggles. The unfair dismissal. The way they blackballed you. The paycheck they stole from you. You shouldn't have to fight this alone. Her stomach twisted. How did he know? Before she could ask, Henry turned to the four lawyers standing like statues in her doorway. These men aren't just here to look intimidating, he said with a smirk. They're here to help. The tallest lawyer, a sharp-featured man with a smooth, calculating tone, stepped forward. Miss Carter, he said formally, we have already reviewed the details of your case. The company that fired you not only violated multiple employment laws but also engaged in fraudulent practices by withholding your wages. We can take them to court and ensure they not only pay you what you are owed but compensate you for the damages they have caused. Laura blinked, overwhelmed. Ooh, you already looked into it? Henry chuckled. You think I'd give my money to just anyone? He crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. I had to be sure, Laura. You fought for what was right and got punished for it. That doesn't sit well with me. It was starting to make sense. The calm confidence, the connections, the fact that he had 4 elite attorneys standing in a grimy apartment hallway in the middle of the night. Laura's mouth went dry. Who are you? The lawyers shifted uncomfortably, as if this was a question they expected but still didn't like answering. Henry, however, simply sighed and leaned against the doorframe. Henry Holloway, he said. Owner of Holloway and Lynch, the biggest damn law firm in the state. Laura's pulse pounded in her ears. She had heard that name before. Everyone had heard that name before. Holloway and Lynch wasn't just a law firm, it was the law firm. The kind that represented billion-dollar corporations, high-profile politicians, and people so powerful they never had to fight their own battles. Henry studied her expression and let out a bitter chuckle. Didn't expect that, did you? She swallowed. Oh, I thought. She trailed off, suddenly feeling like an idiot. She had seen him as just another forgotten old man, abandoned by a cruel world. But Henry wasn't just a victim. He was a king who had walked away from his own kingdom. His lips twitched. You thought I was just some lonely old man, sitting on a bench, waiting for scraps of kindness? He nodded as if to himself. That's what my son thought too. That's why he wanted me gone. Laura's stomach churned. She thought of Henry's son, the one who had rejected him. She imagined the arrogance, the entitlement of a man who thought himself above his own father, above the sacrifices that had built his life. She had seen that type before. The corporate boys who had sneered at her when she tried to do the right thing. The executives who had laughed behind closed doors while signing away the futures of the people beneath them. People like Henry's son. People like the bastards who had stolen everything from her. Anger surged in her chest, but before she could say anything, Henry sighed and ran a hand through his silver hair. I built something great, Laura. Something powerful. But I built it for people who never truly saw me. The world looked at me and still saw just another black man who got lucky. Even my own family. His voice was quiet but firm. They wanted the power. Not me. Laura swallowed hard, shame creeping into her. She had judged him too. Assumed his struggle was like hers, raw, simple, something that just happened to people like them. But Henry had chosen his fate. Walked away from power, from influence. He could have lived in a penthouse, surrounded by luxury, but instead, he had ended up alone on a bench in the cold. And yet, despite it all, he had chosen to help her. Her fingers tightened around the check, the legal documents. This was a lifeline. The kind of second chance people like her never got. And yet, a part of her hesitated. What if I lose? She murmured. The lead lawyer gave a small, humorless smile. You won't. Henry nodded. They think they're untouchable, just like my son does. Just like every bastard who believes their power makes them untouchable. He met her gaze. You can take them down. And I'll make damn sure you do. A shuddering breath left her lips. For the first time in over a year, she felt something shift inside her. Not just hope. Possibility. She met Henry's eyes and slowly she nodded. All right, she whispered. Let's burn them to the ground. Laura stood outside the courthouse, her breath visible in the crisp winter air, the final legal documents clutched tightly in her hands. The official stamp of victory felt heavier than she had expected, as if it carried the weight of every sleepless night, every moment of doubt, every humiliation she had endured at the hands of men who had thought she was powerless. But she wasn't powerless anymore. The security firm that had stolen her paycheck, slandered her name, and tried to erase her from the industry had been forced to pay. Every single penny they had withheld. With interest. The court had ruled in her favor, and the look on those smug executives' faces when the judge read the verdict had been more satisfying than any battlefield victory she had ever experienced. They had underestimated her. They had assumed she would disappear, that she would take their abuse and fade into the background like so many others before her. They had been wrong. She looked up at Henry, who stood beside her, his hands tucked into the pockets of his long wool coat. Despite his usual calm demeanor, there was a glint of satisfaction in his sharp eyes. He had supported her every step of the way, his presence a steady force through the chaos. "You did it," he said, his voice steady but warm. Laura let out a shaky breath, the cold biting at her cheeks. "We did it." Henry chuckled. "No, Laura. You did it. I just made sure the right people were in the right places. You fought for this." She shook her head. "I wouldn't have stood a chance without you. Without them." She gestured toward the courthouse, where the team of lawyers Henry had provided were still inside, wrapping up the final formalities. "Maybe," Henry admitted, his gaze thoughtful. "But power without purpose is nothing. You had the purpose. I just gave you the tools." Laura stared down at the thick stack of legal papers in her hands. The money was substantial. Enough to not only clear her debts but to start fresh, to rebuild her life in a way she had once thought impossible. And yet, it wasn't the money that made her feel victorious. It was the knowledge that she had won. That the men who had laughed at her, dismissed her, called her difficult and unstable, had been forced to answer for what they had done. But she knew the truth. If she hadn't met Henry that night, if she hadn't stopped for just a moment to help an old man alone on a bench, none of this would have happened. One small act of kindness. One moment of humanity. And here she was, standing in front of the same system that had once spat her out, now forcing it to acknowledge her, to pay for what it had done. Henry let out a slow breath, his gaze fixed on the city skyline. "I spent a long time thinking I had wasted my life," he murmured. "Built an empire, only for my own son to see me as nothing but a liability. Gave my blood, sweat, and years to a country that still sees me as just another black man who got lucky. And yet..." He looked at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. Maybe it wasn't a waste after all. Laura swallowed the lump in her throat. She had seen men like Henry before, men who had done everything right, who had fought harder than anyone else, only to be told they were still not enough. Men who had bled for a nation that had never truly accepted them. Men who, despite it all, had still given. She stepped forward and pulled him into a tight hug. Henry tensed for a moment before relaxing, his hands resting lightly on her back. "Thank you," she whispered. "For everything." Henry chuckled against her shoulder. "You're making an old man soft, Carter." She pulled away, smirking. "I think you were always soft. You just hid it under all that legal intimidation." His eyes twinkled. "Maybe." They stood there for a moment, the world moving around them, people passing by without a second glance. But to Laura, the city felt different now. Brighter. She had spent so long feeling like she was drowning, like the world was pressing down on her, suffocating her beneath the weight of unfairness, corruption, and rejection. But she wasn't drowning anymore. She had fought. And she had won. As they started walking away from the courthouse, Henry spoke again, his voice light but laced with something deeper. "So what now?" Laura exhaled, considering the question. She had the money. She had the freedom. She could disappear, move somewhere warm, and never think about this nightmare again. But then she thought of all the others. The other women who had been silenced. The veterans who had been discarded. The people who had been told they were nothing because they didn't fit into the mold of who was supposed to win in this world. Her lips curved into a slow, knowing smile. "Now," she said, "we burn the rest of them to the ground,